All right, y'all ready to roll? All right, let's jump in. Um, we are doing the fourth Great Awakening. So I'm going to walk you through, but I'm going to open in prayer first. So please pray with me. Lord, we come before you, and we ask that you would be with us as we look at this Great Awakening and the things that you have done in and through it. And we ask that it would speak to our hearts and our minds. In your name, amen. All right. Okay, so the fourth Great Awakening is, we've made it through three. Now you're on to the fourth one, which is kind of a weird one. But I love it. I love what's taking place. You're looking at 1960s through basically 1980. So it's a very wild time. And what you're gonna see is a lot of the things that we just see in the church today as how it is came about because of this time. This wasn't always how it is, and it started 1960 through 1979. I'm going to take you through a lot of different kind of controversial aspects that are taking place. And then we're going to round it out with the big major influencer, which is going to be in the 70s through the 80s. So I do have a quote for you. This is towards the latter part of it, but this is from Ted Wise. Does anybody know the name Ted Wise? All right. So you'll know what he's associated with, but he says, Jesus knocked me off my metaphysical ass. Now, if you when I first heard that, I immediately thought of Paul. And Paul is, on the road to Damascus. One of the distinctives about Paul is that he's not looking for Jesus. He is not trying to figure out the course of his life. He's not trying to move to the next phase of his life. He is very comfortable. He's very happy with his life. And he is not looking to change anything. And it's one encounter with Jesus radically changes the entirety of his life. And you're going to see the same thing with Ted Wise and a whole group of people that are going to be in the same camp as him. So I gave you that quote just to kind of kick it off. So the first thing is, is this an actual Great Awakening? Is there actually four Great Awakenings, or are there just three? Because there's lots of debate that what I'm going to share with you does not really fit the standards of what we would expect out of a Great Awakening. Meaning that there's only three Great Awakenings, and this isn't one of them. So there's a lot of people who question whether this is an actual Great Awakening or not. I think that it is. And the reason I think that it is because there's a ton of shifts that are taking place. But what takes place in the 70s, I think, is going to mark it as a Great Awakening. The rest of it are just pretty big shifts in the church. The church is getting shaken up. It's looking different. There are different groups that are rising and other groups are lowering. It's a shakeup in the actual church. But what happens in the 70s, I think it is an actual awakening. And so that's why I look at it as the fourth Great Awakening. But I did want you to know that not everybody considers this one of the Great Awakenings. They would just stop at three. So I already went over all that. I do think it's the fourth Great Awakening. So what's going to take place in the 60s and 70s is there's a fight over the secularization of the culture. That the culture has become very secularized, meaning that the decisions that are happening in the political sphere are not being influenced in and through Christianity. Now, that may be commonplace to you, and you might just be like, well, I would expect that. And I don't think that the religion should affect the politics. But it wasn't commonplace back then. Everything ran through the church. So what you're looking at, and these are the topics that are really being talked about during that time. And if you look at it, what are we, 50 years, 55 years basically from this, maybe 65. If you're looking, we're still dealing with the same stuff. A lot of the stuff is still on here, but this is the very beginning of the talks of homosexuality. And what do you do with homosexuality? It's going to go all the way back to the 60s, to the 70s. The role of the Bible, what role should the Bible play? It's going to go all the way back to there. Divorce is something that starts taking place at this time. Prayer in school, should we have it? Should we not have it? Abortion, what do we do with women? Sex outside of marriage. All these things are being debated during this time. And what's taking place in the political sphere is that the church is not as influential as it once was. And so that's going to cause some shakeups. And the first thing that the church does is it makes a decision on what they think about that. And so you're going to have your conservative churches, which is, what would be your conservative churches back then? Would be primarily your Southern Baptist, your Pentecostals, obviously all of your holiness churches. All of those are going to be what is regarded as your conservative churches, and they're going to want to push back against this. Your mainline liberal denominations and all, I know that there are conservative churches in the mainline churches, but by and large, the mainline churches generally fit the bill as the more liberal of the churches. So who's in that camp? That kind of at the top of that camp. But that would be your Lutherans, your Presbyterians, your regular Baptist. What's that? Most of your Methodists, but not the holiness segment of the Methodists. All of those kinds of groups. Now, what's going to take place when you've got these two roads that you can go down is something that really nobody expected. And that's that all of your mainline, more liberal churches began to shrink, and all of your conservative churches began to explode in numbers. And that's something that was not really anticipated. And so I've just put a little chart up there so you can see. This came out in 2023, and it's giving you a 5-year look at the decline of the mainline churches. And so you can see that we fit in right there. The reason that the blue is really short and the green is really tall is because if you were to go back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years before this chart, you would see massive declines in the Episcopal Church. And so, but you see it across the board. Look at the Presbyterians, super short. The Lutherans are declining radically over the last 5 years. Same with the Methodist Church. All of the mainline churches have been in a spiral of decline that goes all the way back to basically the 60s and the 70s. That's where it began. And all of the power that the mainline churches have they lost. And so, if you were to just look out at Christianity and you were to say, okay, what would be the effect of every Episcopal church no longer existing? You just wipe it out. What would be the effect on Christianity? Nothing. We are basically irrelevant. You could wipe us out and it would affect the overall church very minimally. And it's the same thing you can do with the Presbyterians, same thing you can do with, now if you took all of us out at the same time, that would have a massive effect. But if you were to just focus on one of these groups and just take them out, it would have very minimal effect on the church as a whole. And it goes back all the way to the 60s and 70s where we, as the mainline church, lost our voice, our power. And what gained the power is what's going to fill the void. So anytime you have something that has a lot of power and a lot of influence, once that thing goes away, there will be something that will come up and fill that void. And so what we're going to look at is what filled the void, because it wasn't the Pentecostal church, right? And it wasn't the Southern Baptist, and it wasn't the holiness churches either. None of those churches actually filled the void. What's going to fill the void is going to create a mega shift. And I use that word on purpose, because what's going to fill the void is a massive non-denominational influx of churches into the United States. You might think the non-denominational church is relatively new phenomenon in the United States. It's not. It's going to go all the way back to the 60s and 70s. The non-denominational church is going to come in and sit in that place. And the non-denominational church has a way of creating mega churches, and one of the, it just happens by the way that they're structured. So if you were to take the Episcopal Church and you were to look at the Episcopal Church and you said, okay, how is the Episcopal Church structured? How is it structured in this area? Any ideas how it's structured in this area? It's a neighborhood church, meaning that in every neighborhood there's supposed to be an Episcopal church. There's one in Melbourne. There's one in O'Galley. There's one in Cocoa Beach. There's one in Suntree. There's one here. There's one in Cocoa. So all over the place are these churches. And it's in the best interest of the diocese and the Episcopal Church that all of those Episcopal churches be healthy, meaning that they are self-sustaining. They have enough people that they're self-sustaining, and ideally what you would have is every one of those churches would have about 300 people, and that would create pretty healthy church environment. Now, what happens if Holy Apostles explodes to 600 average Sunday attendance?
You get that building.
You're right. But what would happen outside of this place?
The other ones would go downhill.
What's that?
The smaller churches, the people that came from there to here, those churches would go downhill.
Yes, St. John's is going to take a beating, right? And Holy Trinity is going to take a beating. And same thing with Christ Church over in Suntree. Because when we're doing that, what's generally taking place is that we're taking from other churches and fitting them in here, and all of the other churches begin to go down. It's not in the best interest of the Episcopal Church. But how many coastline community churches are there?
coastline?
Yeah, the one on O'Galley.
Yeah, that big
How
one.
many right now?
How many of those exist?
Like that?
Yeah. No, coastline. With the name coastline. One.
Yeah.
They could care less. They could care less where the people come from and the effect on the larger community out there. They are just acquiring as many people as possible because they're not affiliated or associated with any other churches. They're it. It's basically the Roman Catholic model. So the Roman Catholic model, how many Roman Catholic churches are in this area?
One beach side. One beach side, one on the coast, one
So generally, what the Roman Catholic Church tries to do is they try to spread their churches out far enough that they can acquire large groups of people in one building because they don't want to compete with themselves. Now, why do they do that? They've been doing it for a long time, but one of the main reasons they do it is because they have a clergy shortage. And so they by necessity, they need to do that. But they don't have a clergy shortage. They're just putting churches down, acquiring all these people. It creates a mega church atmosphere. And what's going to come out of the non-denominational church is mega churches. And it's just going to happen naturally. It wasn't necessarily planned. It just naturally happens. And it's planned today. But it wasn't necessarily planned when it started. It just facilitates mega churches because they're not affiliated with anything else. So the mega church non-denominational model are connected. You also have during this time parachurch organizations that we talked about before, but now they're not affiliated with any denomination. They go in and out of every different denomination. And so you can look at all kinds of parachurch organizations that are going to pop up. Previously, they were affiliated with church denominations. We're an organization that is affiliated with the Methodist Church or the Episcopal Church or the Presbyterian Church. And so they work with those churches. What takes place when non-denominational churches really rise to take the place as the prominent church in the United States is now you have parachurch organizations that don't care about denominational lines at all. And they go in and out of denominational lines completely. And so that's another thing that takes place. And what you're seeing is the demise of the denomination. Your denomination does not matter. That's what's being emphasized in the 60s and 70s. And to some degree, I love that. I love that idea. Because what they're doing is they're replacing what did matter, which is I'm Presbyterian and I live in this area, therefore I go to this church. And what they're looking at and they're saying is, I'm Presbyterian and I live in this area, but that Presbyterian church is awful and I ain't going there. So I'm going to go to the Methodist church down the road because that's a really good church. And all their family's going to say, but you're Presbyterian. They're going to say, I don't care. I'm going to the Methodist church. I'm going to the church that I think is doing the best job at being the church, and I don't care what denomination it is. I like that. So now, obviously, for the Episcopals, that's a harder thing to do. It's easier for Methodists to transfer into Presbyterian, but when you're a liturgical person who worships through liturgy, you don't have a whole lot of options. What's that? Yeah, but only about half of your Lutherans, because the other half are really going to downplay liturgy, and it's basically being in a Presbyterian church. It is very limiting. All right, so moving on from there, you're at the same time that this is taking place, and I'm going to say this over and over and over again. At the same time this is taking place, something else is happening. And one of the things that's taking place is a charismatic awakening. And are you familiar, anybody familiar with the charismatic awakening of the 60s and 70s? I mean, this is huge. Not Joel Osteen. Definitely not Joel Osteen.
Well, he's among as big as churches, and he's up there.
You know how old Joel Osteen is?
Yeah, he's not.
He's a pup on the porch during this time.
Yeah.
You know, they just got these huge individual personalities
Yes,
that suck everybody from everywhere.
we're definitely going to get to the Joel Osteen.
This is also known as the ecumenical movement, right?
Yes.
Same idea.
The charismatic awakening is going to take place. And what this is this is alongside all this is happening, this charismatic awakening is going to focus on the gifts of the Spirit. Speaking in tongues, prophesying, and healing primarily, but other things are going to take place as well. The awakening seems to have started or stemmed from the Pentecostal church, but it's going to go into places you would never imagine it to go. Do you know that there are Roman Catholic charismatic churches? Do you know that there's an entire denomination, the Charismatic Episcopal Church? Do you know that it even went into the Frozen Chosen, to the Presbyterians? And there were charismatic Presbyterians? I mean, that's stunning to me. Well, maybe there's only 3, but there's, yeah, they were predestined. The charismatic awakening is going to spread out, and it's going to affect all of the different denominations. I actually did my mentor ministry, which is when you're going through seminary, your second year, you have to pick a church, and then you have to work with that church for like 6 months, and they train you for what you need and all of that, and then you leave. But I did mine with a guy that was a priest in a charismatic Episcopal church. He was just an absolutely wild man. The church that he was in was not a charismatic Episcopal church, but he had started in the charismatic Episcopal church and then filtered into the larger Episcopal church, but you couldn't shake that from him. Like all the charismatic aspects that he just brought it with him. So this is taking place as well. Alongside that, you're going to have your prosperity gospel. And this is where Tom jumped ahead. You're going to have these guys start shooting up all over the place, but not Joel Osteen, because Joel Osteen is a young pup. You're going to have the old school prosperity guys. You're going to have Oral Roberts. You're going to have Jimmy Swaggart. You're going to have Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, Jerry Falwell, Jesse Duplantis, and Pat Robinson. So these are the guys that are going to start taking root, and I could not resist putting Jim and Tammy Faye up there. Just a side note, when I was a youth minister, one of the big youth ministers at the time, so this is like 2000, one of the big youth ministers was their son, Jim Baker. And he was fascinating. But one of the things that he talked about a lot was the effect of growing up with Jim Baker and Tammy Faye as his mom. It basically destroyed the entire family. But It's just a side note. I just thought I always thought that was super interesting.
Suicide, because I was in Oklahoma at the time, and I mean, just all of those families blew up.
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy Swaggart attacked Jim and Tammy Faye when their stuff came out, and then he got caught with prostitutes. And I mean, it's all over the place. You go through the whole line. Jerry Falwell actually probably fared the best in the whole thing. And I don't know if you know, but Jerry Falwell was really good friends with, I can't remember his name, but the guy who did Hustler magazine. Yeah, they were super good friends and had just this really respectful relationship with each other, even though Jerry tried to convert them continuously. But Jerry Falwell still had his own issues. Tom?
Every one of those people came along because of TV.
Yes.
Just stay home and be a Christian.
Yeah, so
And send money.
Send me on.
There's a song, Video Killed the Radio Star. Yeah? You familiar with that? Once TV came along, the radio preachers kind of went by the wayside. And what you're going to see, and you can see it, you can track this. These guys, when they started, not really the best looking individuals. But as it goes on, the requirement to be a televangelist goes up. You've got to be an attractive individual. Now there are a couple that really push the bounds on there. I'm not going to mention Joyce Meyer or anything, but but you go through and you look at this taking place. So you have the charismatic movement, you've got mega church movement, you've got non-denominationals popping up everywhere. Now you have the prosperity gospel as well as the televangelist. And what keeps falling down further and further and further is mainline denominations: Episcopal, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist. Down, 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 all the way down. And all of these are becoming more and more the thing. And then you're going to get into the big thing. And this is the big thing that takes place in the 70s. And this is why I think that this is an actual great awakening. What we've been looking at are shifts in the church. The church has shifted away from mainline denominations towards non-denominational churches, and that has brought about all of what we just looked at. But this is going to change everything. You're familiar with the Jesus movement, yeah? What's that?
I was there.
I was there, yeah. I figured I'd have some I was there.
Got the t-shirt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been to that one.
My in-laws are super hippies. Well,
The music club, and
they
then it
were.
was the rise of the Christian radio station. There were Christian radio stations
Yep.
before this, and this is when Christian rock music all came to the front.
This is why you have
One of my
Striper.
favorite songs. One of my favorite songs at the time was "I'm Not Religious, I Just Love the Lord."
Yeah, and
Song.
that's the theme of basically the Jesus movement. So what you're going to have is a group of outcast hippies who love drugs, love music, they're anti-religious, and all of a sudden they have an encounter with Jesus. And this is Ted Wise. He's a big part of the Jesus movement. And that quote that I gave you at the very beginning is him talking about how did this happen? And it's just, I had a massive encounter with Jesus that changed my life. I wasn't looking for Jesus. I wasn't, searching for something in my life. I was pretty content, and I encountered Jesus, and he changed my life completely. But strangely enough, the countercultural lifestyle that led them straight to the church the Bible, and Jesus. And so you have this new faith in these very strange individuals. Again, my in-laws were hippies. They lived on a commune they grew their own food. They lived by a guy who lived in a mud hut, and they used to go hang out with them, and they basically smoked weed all the time. And they are part of this. They became Christians during this time and completely changed their life. And this is one of the key elements of this. The Jesus movement isn't, yes, I like Jesus, and I also am, it's a radical lifestyle change. They actually bought into the entirety of the Bible, into the entirety of the person Jesus. They walked away from their lifestyle, just walked away from it. It's a real, true conversion that's taking place in this massive group of people. I'm not familiar with this, but that's called Pirates Cove in California. And it's supposed to be really well known, and you probably can't see it, but all those people there, they're all getting baptized. And this is where they did baptisms like daily. And they would bring these large groups down, and they would just baptize people. And tons of them were from the Jesus movement. And so it's a short moment. It's going to last about 10 years. But it's going to have a really big lasting effect. And part of the effect is that it's going to produce new churches. So Calvary Chapel is a church that came out of the Jesus movement. Your vineyard churches that are all over the place, those are Jesus movement churches. Parachurch organizations like Jews for Jesus, it's going to come out of the Jesus movement. Youth movements like Campus Crusade for Christ is coming out of this as well. Yeah. And so all of these are huge. Like Calvary Chapel is really big. Like it's a pretty big deal. And the vineyard churches, do we have vineyard churches around here? Because I don't know them to be around here. But if you were to go north, your vineyard churches are everywhere. And the worship music that is being put out on CDs is often coming out of the vineyard churches that's producing that music, because the biggest impact that they're going to have is in the world of music. And they're going to radically change Christian music. So they're going to change contemporary Christian music. So if anybody listens to Z88.3, that wouldn't exist without this. If you're again, your worship music is being, this is where hymns start going away. This is the death of hymns and the rise of a new type of worship music that is taking place in the church. You also have this group of heavy metal bands that look and sound just like everybody else that's coming out during that time, but they're Christian. And if you look at the lyrics, you're like, oh, wow, okay. And so all that is happening, but probably the biggest impact, to be honest, is the death of the organ. That's got to be one of the biggest impacts they're going to have, is they're going to shift the organ out of the church, and they're going to replace it with guitars and drums. And that's a really big shift that is going to take place during the Jesus movement. Thoughts on that? Questions? Yeah, Tom.
No matter what you see, these people are still, all of us, looking for Jesus.
Yeah.
They don't know how to do it. They don't have what I would call.
Well, they don't know how to do it like we do it, but they know how to do it like they're doing
They're
it.
doing it, they're trying,
Yeah.
and they're still, I call them Christians, but they are, I think they're misled. That the Joel Osteens and these charismatics.
These guys are not following Joel
No,
Osteen.
no, I'm wrong again. But they're looking, I was in Westminster Abbey last week. There was 15,000 people in that abbey. A lot of them are young people. And they were looking, and I think they're still searching. I think we lost that generation, and they themselves are looking. That's why these churches get.
This generation is the last generation that you actually retained. After this generation, you lost the Gen Xers, you lost the Millennials, and you lost the Gen Z and the Gen Ys or whatever they are. You lost all those generations. But this generation changed the church. But they are the church right now. And a lot of them are sitting in Episcopal churches. This is actually the last generation that was basically walking out the door. They were gone. They were out of the church. They wanted nothing to do with it. And rather than the church being able to pull them back in, they just had an encounter with Jesus. And it's why they want nothing to do with religion. They want nothing to do with what is standard religious practice. That's why you don't see a ton of them in the Episcopal Church, in the Methodist Church, in the Lutheran Church, because they don't want to deal with all of the not just politics, but that too. But they don't want to deal with all the structure, all the bounds, all the things that you have to do. Because they're looking at it from the perspective of, well, why do I have to do that? And people will say, well, you have to do that because, well, we've always done that. And they'll say, well, I don't care. I don't want to do that. I don't want to have these meetings. I don't want to sit in this group and do this thing. I don't understand why we have to use these old instruments that nobody uses anymore. I don't understand why we have to do these things. In fact, I don't think we have to do these things. And so they're throwing out standard traditional Christianity, and they're replacing it with what you're seeing taking place in the charismatic churches, in the non-denominational churches, in the mega churches, in all of these other churches that filled the void. They're funneling into those churches. And they don't have to deal with all the stuff that they would consider to be junk. Billy, Sarah.
And long enough here comes along Billy Graham. What do we do with him? Where does he fit?
But he's certainly going to be around this time. So you're going to have the same thing popping up with his crusades and these big come to Jesus conferences. And one of the things that's interesting about Billy Graham is that he transcended all of this. So the Jesus movement people, they like Billy Graham. And denominational people, they also like Billy Graham. And the charismatics, they like Billy Graham too. And the mega churches, they're pretty into Billy Graham as well. And so Billy Graham is able to kind of transcend all of these. And as all of these are taking place, Billy Graham is functioning in that environment. And so it's kind of, it's the birth of the mega revivals that you see, like the stadium tours where people will come in. It doesn't really happen today because the church doesn't have that that pull that they used to. But you used to have people that were able to do stadium tours where they would come in and basically like a rock band, they would preach from stadium to stadium, or they would have services from stadium to stadium. But it doesn't really draw people today. You can't fill a stadium anymore. Yeah, Sarah.
You may not realize it, but this movement is in this church too. And it's infiltrated in a number of ways. For instance, none of the women in this room are wearing hats. And there was a point where we would have all had to have hats on to be here.
I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
and women wear slacks to church or different things like that, and that have come, and not to mention women in the church in general. But this has come out of this movement, and those of us that were touched by this movement and then still sought structure. I went from Southern Baptist to Episcopalian at 20, and it was this movement.
Yeah.
It was this, and you know, so this movement is in this church, and in all the organized churches to some degree, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah, and so the last slide didn't make it in there. But one of the things that's interesting about this is that the Jesus movement people are not friends with your mega churches. They're not necessarily friends with the televangelist and all of those, but they filter into all segments of the church. I forgot to grab you, Tom.
Just like her, I am those people, but I went into this and I came out of it as a lot of people leave these mega churches because we found Jesus, but we didn't get structure.
Yeah. Yep.
And we said, wow, I love this. But then it just was the same thing every Sunday. Lots of music, lots of nothing, and 4 mentions of Jesus. And we came out looking for structure. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm not down in Greenwood Park.
I don't know what's down there.
I have a friend that calls their music 7-Elevens. There are 7 words repeated 11 times.
Yeah. So if you look at what takes place in the non-denominational churches, a lot of times there is a lot of turnover, and what they do a really good job of getting people into the church. And then oftentimes what takes place is what Tom's bringing up, is that they start there and then they move out and they go and they find the structure that works for their style of worship. So maybe they're liturgical, so they'll find a Roman Catholic or an Episcopal, but maybe they're really into the preaching and they're going to go to Presbyterian or Lutheran, or maybe they're really into, I don't know what you have to be into to be Methodist these days, but okay, Ted and then Billy. Potluck dinners.
Adding to what Tom said, I think that at that time, because many of us grew up in that time, in an Episcopal church, you were looking for answers, and the priests either disregarded you because you were young, or they didn't know the answers. And so if you want the answer, quote unquote, you go looking. And one other thing about dress is you would never dream of coming to any function at any church at any time in anything but a suit.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, for men.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people didn't even own suits, so good luck with
And
that.
thank you for advancing to shorts and a t-shirt.
You're welcome, Ted. Billy?
That was this huge group of televangelists and all of the other people you mentioned earlier. We got to worshiping the person rather than Jesus.
Yeah, you do have, particularly in your mega churches, you do have a cult of personality that creeps in very, very easily. But you have that anywhere. Yeah. I mean, that is, by John Calvin says that our hearts are idol factories. And so if you were to remove an idol, we would just create another one. And you remove that, we create another one. And unfortunately, one of the things that we like to do is to idolize people. We do this in television, we do this in movies, we do this in sports, we do this in everything that we do. And the same way that we like to idolize them and put them up there, we also like to knock them off. It is one of the things that you certainly want to guard against is the cult of personality, because it is very dangerous. And it really sets the person up for disaster. Nobody can live up to those standards. So nobody can live under that. That's why you see these people fall so often, particularly in the church. It's very easy for people to fall really quickly. And we've seen it over the years, over and over and over again. The last thing that I wanted to bring up before I close, and I'll take questions after this, is what you'll see in the 4 Great Awakenings is that the first Great Awakening is a return. If you remember, it's a return to Jesus and a throwing out of religion. And the 4th Great Awakening is a return to Jesus and a throwing out of religion. And in between those, you have the 2nd Great Awakening and the 3rd Great Awakening, and they're very similar in themselves. And their emphasis is on social activism and getting out there getting what you want from the culture and into the culture. So you're seeing 4 Great Awakenings, but 2 of them, the 1st and the 4th, very similar, and the 2nd and the 3rd, very similar, and they're emphasizing very different things. I much prefer the 1st and the 4th to the 2nd and the 3rd. Anytime you have a group of people who are just following after Jesus and don't care about all of the hang-ups and all the, obviously that's who I am. Otherwise, I would have a jacket on, and I would have this in, my shirt would be tucked in, and I wouldn't have this, and I would just look very different. I would look like the normal Episcopal priest out there. Because for me, all that I really care about is Jesus. All that I really want to do is to proclaim Jesus and to administer the sacraments. One of these days, I am going to stir up an organic amen that just explodes, but people just can't hold it in. Billy.
Now we have this humongous group of people that are worshiping other people, and we don't really know who they're worshiping. Right? They claim that they're worshiping Jesus, but they're worshiping Joel Osteen.
The prosperity preachers and the televangelists are very, that's the bad side of this. The good side of this, I think, is the charismatic movement that you have taking place, the Jesus movement that you have taking place, and then the non-denominational and the mega churches is just kind of in between. There's some good, there's some bad. So I think there's a bad side of this, I think there's a good side of this, and then I think there's the in-between of this. But the thing is that they're all happening at the same time, and it radically shifts the culture of the church to the point that we are where we are right now, which is your mainline denominations have very little power and influence, and if we vanished, you'd have very little effect on the church as a whole, basically irrelevant. But what is relevant right now is what is taking place in other parts of the church. And I don't mean to belittle the Episcopal Church or the mainline denominations. That's just the reality of it. I mean, we do not have the power and the influence that we think that we do or that we once had. So I got to wrap it up. Final questions. Yeah, Leslie.
This, this fourth grade awakening is the time also where the emphasis was on a personal relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, it's all personal.
And our pop culture was greatly influenced by things like Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell. It appealed to the young people during the time that I was a young person.
Yeah, all of this is definitely emphasizing personal relationship with Jesus. That's what they care about. We want a personal relationship with Jesus. Yes, you're doing all your liturgy, and it looks nice, and it smells good, and it's very fancy, but do you know Jesus? That's what they care about. And so, what's funny is that when you all look at their churches, you're like, there's nothing there. It's garbage, bunch of junk. But when they look at the Episcopal Church or the Presbyterian Church or the Lutheran Church, I hear the exact same thing. They're all dead. They're dead churches with dead people who don't know Jesus. And so what might actually be helpful is if the two experienced each other once in a while. I'm going to round it out there. I'm rounding it out with Carol's final quote. Grab some coffee or